My final presentation will be on EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Some of the topics I will cover throughout this presentation include the development and history of EMDR, the session structure created by its creator, various applications for EMDR, as well as the efficacy of said applications, training and certification requirements in order to practice EMDR, as well as my personal experience having engaged in the modality with my therapist. EMDR, or originally EMD as it was known, was created by Dr. Francine Shapiro in 1987. Oddly enough, the impetus for her decision to develop this modality was what she observed during a walk in the park one day. She noticed that as she shifted her gaze from left to right and back again repeatedly, the negative emotions she had been feeling at the time seemed to be alleviated. Thus, she developed what was originally called EMD and subsequently added a reprocessing component to the protocol, hence the name EMDR. Some of the core principles as well as development of EMDR as a modality for trauma treatment that I found to be noteworthy were, as I previously mentioned, the introduction of the reprocessing component in 1991, which was included as a reflection of Dr. Shapiro's increasing insight into the modality's efficacy, as well as cognitive changes she observed throughout the course of developing the treatment. She also developed an information processing protocol by which the effects of EMDR may be measured or monitored. As far as practicing EMDR, there are several ways in which this can be achieved. One is by using a visual source, anything from the clinician's finger traveling back and forth to a laser pointer to any other visual stimulus, allowing the client to focus on and follow from side to side. This is also achievable using vibrating buzzers, which the client holds one of each in each hand, and the vibrations alternate from side to side. Lastly, this can also be arguably conducted by the use of bilateral tapping, usually on one's shoulders. So therefore, the client would do this to achieve the same bilateral stimulation, achieved by using either a visual or tactile source. However, the efficacy of the visually based approach to EMDR remains somewhat controversial. In spite of this controversy, however, EMDR remains one of the most popular forms of treatment for trauma as well as PTSD. It has perhaps been most popular in the treatment of PTSD. In fact, the World Health Organization, American Psychiatric Organization, as well as a number of other and non-governmental organizations, as well as governmental entities, have all cited EMDR as an effective and often first-line form of trauma treatment. To discuss the development of EMDR in a bit more detail, As I mentioned, the reprocessing component was added to the protocol in 1991. Since its birth, EMDR has proven controversial, as previously mentioned, with many believing that the efficacy of the eye movement aspect of the protocol in particular is questionable in terms of its effectiveness. Proponents of the modality, however, argue that it is effective in treating both big and little t traumas. Furthermore, corresponding with the development of EMD and later EMDR, Dr. Shapiro developed what she deemed the accelerated information processing protocol as a means of measuring the treatment's efficacy. This was later renamed Adaptive Information Processing, or AIP. Using the AIP protocol, EMDR is used as a mechanism of reprocessing and then restoring information relating to traumatic events, and is further assessed by employing the AIP protocol also developed by Dr. Shapiro. This model is based on the presupposition that information is not properly stored at the time of a traumatic event. This later causes the sufferer to experience perceptions, emotions, distorted thoughts, as though the client was still experiencing the trauma in real time. There remains debate as to whether EMDR ought to be considered a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, or whether it is in fact its own discrete modality best utilized for hotspot or therapeutic event processing. Regardless, EMDR does include the basic components required for trauma therapy, such as exposure, activation, emotional disparity recognition, contradiction, and desensitization. As the modality was further studied, Shapiro developed a specific structure by which the treatment is to follow. According to Dr. Shapiro's structure, the opening of the session, usually the first 5 to 15 minutes, is intended to include a pre-briefing for the client, which explains the rationale for exposure treatment in order to address trauma. The client's symptomology is explored and specifically examined in terms of how the client experiencing upsetting symptomology is in fact one of the mind's ways of healing. Unresolved traumatic events, therefore, must be processed for healing to occur. This is made clear during the debriefing process. If this is not the clinician's first session with the client, any changes to the client's life or new traumatic events or dysfunctional behaviors are discussed, along with any increase of avoidance or intrusive symptoms as compared with the previous session. Obviously, if this is the first session, those inquiries would be adapted to assess the client's current state of being and level of arousal, as well as dysfunctional behavior. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the opening of the session is intended to provide the clients with assurance regarding safety prior to moving on to the next phase. Midway through the session, which Dr. Shapiro intended to be roughly the next 20 to 30 minutes, must be used to ensure that the treatment is being applied within the therapeutic window. If that is in fact the case, the clinician will begin cognitive, emotional, and memory processing. However, if such processing proves contraindicated, if, for instance, the client becomes too aroused or otherwise unable to tolerate this intervention in a way that would prove effective, psychoeducation or general discussion of a less activating topic can be substituted, until at which point the client is prepared for more intense processing of their trauma. The next portion of the session, which Dr. Shapiro delegated to the next 15 to 20 minutes, is meant to debrief, normalize, and validate clients' trauma. Also, ensure that this phase remains within the therapeutic window. And if so, processing continues. Additionally, the clinician would inquire as to the client's subjective experience during processing. Again, if processing proves contraindicated, psychoeducation or general discussion may again be substituted, until at which point the client is prepared for more intense processing regarding trauma or a specific traumatic event. If during this phase the client's level of arousal remains high, the clinician ought to work to de-escalate, either through further processing, grounding, or by focusing on non-emotional issues. The end of the session, intended to occupy the last 5 to 10 minutes or so, is intended to remind the client about possibly delayed effects of trauma processing. These might include flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance behaviors, or other maladaptive coping mechanisms that the client might use in response to re-experiencing the trauma. Additionally, at the end of session, the clinician ought to provide the client with safety planning if necessary, based on any established dangers toward self or others, or the propensity for self-harm behaviors identified in session or previously, perhaps during assessment. The clinician must provide statements which work to provide the client with closure as well as encouragement. And it is important as well that the clinician explicitly state the time and date of next planned session, making sure that clinician and client are in agreement in that regard. As far as applications of EMDR, one in particular is perhaps the most popular, and that would be among veterans or military personnel suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs practice guidelines both deem EMDR to be within the highest category of trauma treatment. For example, it is recommended for all trauma sufferers at all times, who fall under the umbrella of the Department of Defense or Veterans Affairs. Moreover, The International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies current treatment guidelines also designate EMDR as an effective treatment for PTSD, as have the Departments of Health of Northern Ireland and Israel, which classify EMDR as one of only a small number of treatments of choice for trauma victims. The American Psychiatric Association's practice guidelines also state that a combination of SSRIs, CBT, and EMDR are recommended as first-line treatments of trauma. Now, EMDR also demonstrates efficacy among populations aside from military personnel and veterans. As a matter of fact, the World Health Organization classifies trauma-focused CBT and EMDR as the only psychotherapies recommended for children, adolescents, and adults alike suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I quote, "Like CBT with a trauma focus, EMDR aims to reduce subjective distress and strengthen adaptive cognitions related to the traumatic event. Unlike CBT with a trauma focus, EMDR does not involve A, detailed descriptions of the event, B, direct challenging of beliefs, C, extended exposure, or D, homework." More than 20 randomized studies support EMDR therapy as an effective and efficient treatment of trauma. Additionally, more than 24 randomized studies, along with a recent meta-analysis, all have demonstrated the positive effects of the eye movement component, in spite of its somewhat controversial reputation. The World Health Organization further classifies EMDR and TFCBT as the only treatment modalities effective in treating trauma among children, adolescents, and adults alike. Taking a closer look at EMDR efficacy among various populations, we see that beginning with military personnel and veterans, researched by a Veterans Affairs facility demonstrated a 78% reduction in PTSD based on self-reporting. EMDR is also proven effective among PTSD sufferers who are not military personnel. Kaiser Permanente commissioned a study which demonstrated a self-reported 100% reduction in PTSD symptoms among single trauma clients, while 77% of those who suffered multiple traumas self-report no diagnosable PTSD. EMDR is further deemed effective in the treatment of trauma related to sexual violence. A randomized study of EMDR efficacy among non-military survivors of sexual violence reported that 90% of participants experienced PTSD relief after only 3 90-minute sessions. Another population for whom EMDR is effective are survivors of natural disasters. The modality has been shown to effectively assist trauma resulting from natural disasters, and this is substantiated by a 2016 study focusing on earthquakes in Mexico and Italy, the data collected for which showed a substantial reduction of PTSD symptoms among survivors. With a follow-up after 12 weeks, the assertion EMDR has further demonstrated efficacy among survivors of natural disasters. For instance, a 2016 study which focused on the earthquakes in Mexico and Italy yielded data that indicated a substantial reduction of PTSD symptomology among survivors. After 12 weeks, survivors were followed up with and asserted that by and large, the effects of EMDR proved both substantial and long-lasting. While this study is perhaps not as quantifiably clear as others, it does in fact suggest the efficacy of EMDR in treating survivors of natural disasters. Lastly, EMDR has demonstrated efficacy in treatment of trauma surrounding traffic accidents, or in particular, treating the survivors of traffic accidents. A study commissioned by the Transportation Department revealed that PTSD related to accidents was decreased by a self-reported 67% following 6 EMDR sessions. And on the left-hand side, we see the brain of a woman currently suffering from PTSD, while on the right-hand side is the same woman's brain following 4 90-minute EMDR sessions. I find the difference to be compelling. In terms of training and certification in order to practice EMDR, I thought it best to refer to the EMDR International Association, or EMDRIA, which requires the following of clinicians seeking to use EMDR in their practice. Licensure. Obviously, EMDR therapy cannot be practiced as a form of therapeutic intervention by a person who does not hold a valid license, certification, or registration to practice as a mental health care professional. With regard to experience, EMDIA requires a minimum of 3 years of experience in one's field of licensure, and one also should have conducted at minimum 300 separate sessions with at least 75 different clients. A written statement duly signed and as well as notarized is required to verify individuals seeking EMDR licensure to have completed this requirement. In terms of training, the EMDRIA training program, or a comparable training program based on one's location, is required. The minimum training requirements defined in the curriculum of EMDRIA's training program is 20 hours of instructional material, which includes the history, overview, methodology, and mechanism of EMDR therapy. This instruction is followed by 20 hours of supervised practicum, whereby the trainee undergoes direct behavioral observation and also receives feedback regarding their EMDR practice. The last component of the EMDR training program hourly requirement involves 20 hours of consultation wherein trainees receive feedback on real cases, not experiences, which occurred as part of the practicum. An additional component of the requirements for licensure is consultation. A minimum of 20 hours of consultation by an approved consultant is required, with at least 10 of these hours obtained through an individual EMDR-focused consultation, or phone consultation in rural areas is also acceptable. The remaining 10 hours may be obtained by utilizing small group consultation. However, the group size may not exceed more than 8 people at a given time. Your consultant, or one's consultant, will verify the number of consultation hours one has received, how many of those were individual consultations and how many were group, as well as if the consultation has been completed with more than one consultant. A letter of recommendation from each is also required. Now, letters of recommendation, as previously mentioned, are also a component of the licensure and certification requirements for EMDR, and in this case, EMDRIA. Letters of recommendation from your consultant can be one or more than one verifying your EMDR therapy utilization with clients. Said letters ought to include an evaluation statement from your approved consultant or consultants, and also an endorsal of your certification application. Lastly, EMDR continuing education is required for licensure and certification. The EMDRIA requires 12 units of continuing education, which is available online, and one of the sites provided is indicated here in this slide. Lastly, I wanted to make mention of my personal experience with EMDR. I found it to have created long-lasting and substantial change in terms of my ability to deal with my grief and loss issues, as well as trauma surrounding being a survivor of sexual violence. I was first introduced to EMDR when my therapist suggested it as a means of processing my unresolved grief surrounding the death of my father. I was incredulous initially, admittedly so, but after only one 60-minute session, my incredulity quickly faded. Essentially, following the structure laid out by Dr. Shapiro, my therapist began by explaining the process and what I might possibly expect. She did her best to explain in layman's terms how bilateral brain stimulation can help trauma sufferers to reprocess and properly store traumatic memories which otherwise would continue to be re-experienced. We began with her explanation of the process in general, followed by her asking me to recount the symptoms to which I attribute the traumatic loss of my father. Given the fact that this would be our first session together wherein we engaged in EMDR, my therapist also inquired as to any recent changes in my life or to my behaviors and usage of coping mechanisms, specifically maladaptive coping mechanisms. Once we had covered the initial or introductory phase of the session, I was handed 2 small plastic buzzers to place in each hand, which I soon discovered vibrated in alternating rhythms from left to right. Although I have yet to understand the exact mechanism by which bilateral stimulation helps the brain to reprocess and correctly store traumatic memories. After only one session, I knew one thing for sure, and that was I felt better. Physically, I felt as though, and forgive the cliche, that a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, which I had unknowingly been carrying since my father passed away in 2011. Since then, I have become an ardent proponent of EMDR as a treatment for trauma. That is largely due to the fact that no other technique or intervention that has been tried throughout my nearly 20-year history of being in therapy has proven to be even remotely comparable to the effects that I experienced as a result of engaging in EMDR with my therapist. I believe in its efficacy so much so that I invested in my own set of EMDR buzzers so that I have the necessary equipment to engage in EMDR through telemedicine during this strange era, where we are forced to do so for COVID reasons. In a nutshell, EMDR alleviated trauma symptoms which no other intervention or therapist or psychiatrist had ever been able to affect any kind of real change toward. I believe in it, even though I do not fully understand it. And I hope that once I am licensed, that I will continue on the tradition set by my therapist, which is to use EMDR as best I can and when appropriate, to help my clients process and overcome their trauma. So essentially, just to briefly recap today's presentation, EMDR, originally EMD, was created in 1987 by Dr. Francine Shapiro. Once she later added cognitive components to her treatment protocol, it was renamed EMDR. Shapiro also authored a number of books on the subject prior to her passing. Recap number 2, application or applicability. EMDR has been shown to effectively treat PTSD, bereavement-based trauma, sexual violence-based trauma, and numerous other forms of both big T and little t traumatic events. Moreover, it has been shown to produce substantial and long-lasting change in a relatively short number of sessions when compared with the length of other trauma treatment methodologies. Recap number 3, EMDR session structure. Dr. Shapiro created a very specific and detailed structure with distinct interventions and topics broached based upon both maximizing efficacy and also taking into account the pace set by the client. The start, midway point, later point, and conclusion of EMDR sessions each includes specific sets of protocols, which also allows for some adaptation if deemed necessary by perhaps the client's increased level of arousal or activation. And recap number 4, my experience with EMDR. Since first engaging in the modality with my therapist several years ago, I quickly transformed from a skeptic to a proponent, a strong one at that. No other intervention to which I have been subject has been comparable to the efficacy and long-lasting change with which EMDR has provided me. I consider my ongoing recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder and bereavement-related trauma, as well as sexual violence-related trauma, to be due in large part, if not nearly entirely, to the employment of EMDR, along with a strong therapeutic alliance. And with that, I will close and provide the references and any links with which I have referenced during my presentation. And I thank you very much for listening.